Okay. Hello and welcome to the Politics first ever Mental Health Roundtable. My name is Sophia Hahn. I'm a sophomore in Jonathan Edwards College, majoring in global affairs, and I'll be acting as the moderator for today's discussion. I am lucky enough today to be joined by Dr. Paul Hoffman, who is a clinical psychologist who has worked with mental health and counseling for 15 years. He was named Director of Mental Health and Counseling in February of 2020 and has worked to transition mental health and counseling to provide teletherapy during the pandemic, collaborate with Yale College on developing the new YCQ program to provide new options for mental health and wellness services connected to Yale College, and increase the size and diversity of mental health care to meet the needs of the Yale students. I'm also joined by Dr. Christy Lockhart, who is a senior lecturer as of July 1st, Emeritus of Psychology here at Yale. She is also a licensed clinical psychologist specializing in families and children and former associate of Morse College. I'm also joined by Izzy Hennig, who is a rising junior in Davenport College, majoring in Earth and Planetary Sciences. He is serving as the YSAC subcommittee chair of the YE Matter campaign, focusing on student-athlete mental health and well-being on campus, and works as CCE on campus. I'm also joined by Josh Keeler, who is a college graduate class of 2020. He was a political science major and an energy scholar and varsity football athlete. He hopes to share some insight on toxic masculinity, mental health, and mental health issues in sport. Chelsea Kung, who is a political science major and sophomore in Poly Murray. She is most interested in being part of the real and honest conversation about student-athlete mental health. In her previous academic year, she was the DEI subcommittee leader, and this year is the SAC president. And within SAC, she hopes to continue the conversation and focus on mental health. Olivia Schnur, who is an incoming Yale freshman in Silliman College. Despite being undecided in her major, she is greatly interested in psychology and mental health, especially in adolescence. She was initially drawn to the conversation of mental health resources after attending a very large and competitive high school. She hopes that during her time at Yale, she can become more directly involved in the improvement of student education and aid those struggling with their mental health. And lastly, Julia Wallace, who is an alumna from the class of 2020 and has majored in environmental studies. She's originally from Virginia Beach, and she now spends her free time open water swimming, section hiking, and the Appalachian Trail, and thinking of ways to improve equity in higher education. She is familiar with mental health and counseling at Yale, both as a patient herself and as a first-year counselor. Thank you, everyone, again for your time today and joining me this roundtable, and welcome. Before we begin, I would just like to highlight for the purpose of today's discussion that the purpose of today's discussion is not only to educate the wider community on the emerging mental health crisis in young people, but to also drive the conversation on mental health forward in hopes of establishing a healthier tomorrow. Moreover, for our audience, and as a reminder to our panelists, the format of the conversation will roughly be as follows, in addition to any other topics that the panelists would like to discuss. Firstly, the origins and causes of mental health and the mental health epidemic, the pandemic, mental health on campus, and the future of the trend and public policy. Now, without further ado, we can proceed to the topics, origins, and causes. So with the increasing number of social media posts, memes, and status updates posted online where people, primarily young adults, are discussing their battles with their mental health, and with the recent publishing of several worrying mental health statistics, there is no doubt that we are in the midst of what some professionals and experts are now referring to as an epidemic. To provide you with some statistics, in a 2020 study published by the CDC, it was noted that suicide rates in those aged 10 to 24 had increased by 60% in just the last decade. Additionally, in 2021, the National Institute of Health published a study that highlighted that the prevalence of any mental illness is highest in young adults aged 18 to 25, with a prevalence of 29.4% compared to 25% in those aged 26 to 49, and 14% in those 50 and older. So with all considered, the first question to the panel is, what do you believe are the main factors driving this epidemic, and why are such factors having an impact? Perhaps Dr. Lockhart, you can begin with your thoughts, and anyone who wishes to add their thoughts or insights can use the raise hand button, and we'll continue the conversation from there.
Well, I'm probably the oldest member on the panel here. For sure I am. And I guess what struck me is to talk about this as a new epidemic, because I think it's actually something that's been evolving since the 1980s. I think ever since I've been teaching on college campuses, that people have long been talking about the increase in anxiety and depression in the younger population. When I was trained as a clinical psychologist many years ago, depression was actually a disorder of middle age. So most of the people you saw were older. And in fact, I remember teaching a course on depression and telling my mother I was doing so. And she said, how do you know anything about economics? Because depression to her generation was, the depression that followed the Wall Street crash in the late 1920s. I think this is something that's really been building and building and building. And I have, I think every generation that it has impacted has its own factors that maybe influence it. I think I've been strongly influenced perhaps by some of the readings I've been doing recently by Jean Twenge and John Haidt, where they've been talking about the impact of social media on this generation. The Instagram, compare and despair, the impact of Facebook, the fact that people spend so much time scrolling rather than actually really interacting with one another, that people are much more lonely nowadays than they ever were before. I know when my husband and I were heads of Morris College, we were always struck, and this was beginning in the year 2000, how little time students spent after they ate their dinners talking and just sitting down and communing with each other. The people got up and they were busy and they were off to their activities. And oftentimes those activities involved other college students, but it hadn't been what our college experience had been, which were long hours spent at the dining table, talking about life and, just issues and relating and developing kind of strong bonds with people. So I think there's a number of factors. I teach a course, I taught for many years, of course, on psychopathology in the family. I do think a lot of people do feel like there's less of a structure, a family structure, a community structure that they feel provides them with roots. In some ways, parents are very involved in their children's lives, but sometimes even that over-involvement can be a negative thing, because then children themselves don't learn how to feel like they can master or be resilient in difficult situations, or the situations that normally people would overcome and kind of persevere through. They feel sort of thrown by because their parents have always been there, these sort of helicopter bulldozing parents. So, I think there's a lot of factors, and a lot of these different factors have impacted different generations. But I think this is not just a recent epidemic, just sort of to sum up, but really something that's been developing over time. And now with the pandemic, maybe it's really reached its worst point. I don't know.
Paul, would you like to add to that? Or?
Yeah, I think Christy mentioned something that's kind of important, that this has been building, for some time. But as far as kind of when we've seen, kind of significant upticks, kind of nationally, numbers started to kind of steadily rise about 10 years ago. And we started to see a bit of an uptick then, but we've seen a real acceleration in utilization over really the last 5 years or so. We went from seeing 2,500 students in a year to, now like 4,200 students in a year. And that's with the reduced enrollment. So, the percentage, people utilizing mental health services is increased really significantly over the last 5 years. And one of the trends we're seeing, to, I think, the point about kind of depression and anxiety is, 10 years ago, 10, 11 years ago, the number one thing that college students would be diagnosed with would be something called an adjustment disorder, which is sort of a way of saying kind of transient stress or depressive emotions that are kind of situational, and kind of thought to be short term, with depression being the second most diagnosed and then anxiety being the third most diagnosed. Those have now flipped, where anxiety is the number one diagnosis among college students, depression second, and then adjustment disorders are way down. So I think one way of thinking about it is a lot of those things that were thought to be like transient, anxious or depressed emotions are kind of more intense and maybe longer lasting, in the generation coming through than previous generations. So, to the cause, I think, social media, I think, is a real big factor. I mean, I think when people are curating their lives and then people are consuming curated lives and kind of imagining that's what's real a lot of times and kind of living with that all the time, there's kind of always this kind of, people are kind of living and experiencing people through their like performative selves all the time, you know, and I think that's a hard way to kind of relate to people. And I think, you know, one thing we know that's increased, which I think is particularly like maybe prominent for Yale students, is, you know, the measure of perfectionism has gone up significantly, and we know that, you know, the higher your level of kind of perfectionism, like in some ways, the less resilient you are, you know, because to be happy, to be healthy, to be, you know, to be doing well, you think you have to do everything exactly right, and that can be really hard. And I think, yeah, I think, you know, there's a lot of other factors. I think there's economic factors. I think there's probably climate change. You know, I think there's a lot in the political discourse. If you think about how contentious the political discourse has been over the last 5 years, I think that contributes to people's emotion as well. So I'll stop there.
Christy, you have a response?
I wanted to say something about adjustment disorders, because it's, you know, I remember in my training, we were always told to give people the diagnosis of adjustment disorder because you wanted to see the disorder as transient. And I do wonder whether that's also a different mindset that maybe clinicians have, that maybe we're seeing behaviors in the past that were seen as more transient, as more serious. The other thing I wanted to bring up, and this is because I think all your points are really good about the perfectionism and the competitiveness, and the fact that you're no longer just comparing yourself to people within your own hometown, but universally across the world. I mean, it makes life very, very difficult. But the other thing I think we have to wonder about also is sort of the use of medication. And when we talk about an epidemic, I always think of Robert Whitaker's book, Anatomy of an Epidemic, where he actually talks about that we've really increased the use of medication, oftentimes in treating mental disorders. We do it really early on, that a lot of children are medicated at a young age for ADHD, for whatever, and what kind of long-lasting impact that might really have on people. And I guess one of my concerns has always been the ease with which people hand out antidepressants, because they can have a very positive effect, but over the long term may actually get you into a cycle where you really can't get off of them without crashing. So maybe Paul has other things to say about that as well.
I might have something, but I'll let Juliet and Josh sort of speak first.
Okay. Josh, would you like to go first?
Yeah, Dr. Hoffman, something you said kind of just stuck out in my mind, and I wouldn't necessarily frame this as an attempt to put a positive spin on things, but more of a question. The statistics you kind of raised as far as the increasing usage of mental health services at Yale were kind of alarming to me. Is the statistic, would it be negligible, the sense that people are more willing and open and feel more comfortable visiting mental health services? And is that a potential explanation for at least a portion of that increase, or is that, you know, so small that it's more kind of looking at the negative side and that mental health is decreasing?
I think, I mean, I guess I'll just respond directly to that, but I think it's a little bit of that, and a little, I think what I've noticed is, you know, we used to treat people in a kind of a narrow range, you know, if that's, you know, in some ways, like anybody who is doing really poorly and who's, you know, had a lot of mental health issues, you know, was kind of an outlier, you know, and, you know, and a lot of the people who were coming in, you know, really did need therapy, you know, but and I would say the range of things we treat has kind of expanded, you know, so I think we do see students more commonly with major mental health issues than we used to. So I do think overall distress has increased. And I also think that a lot of the discussions have normalized getting treatment and normalized getting mental health treatment. And I think that's enabled some people who may have not conceptualized their distress as a mental health issue, or conceptualized their distress as in some ways needing therapy, to come in as well. So I think, you know, it's a little bit of a lot of things. I think we've decreased stigma and really promoted awareness of mental health resources, which is really positive. And also, I think we've been seeing more distress in students. So.
Juliet, would you like to add anything?
So I basically had the same question as Josh, actually, but I had one additional question for you as well, Dr. Hoffman. And it was, you know, when we're going through like the big three you mentioned diagnoses that you are typically giving from your office or seeing coming in. Of the beyond those, are we also seeing an increase in, I won't say more serious, but other like concerning symptoms? Are we seeing an increase in other forms of mental illness, or have those stayed relatively stagnant? I'm curious to know.
There's been a slight uptick, but not in the same way as depression and anxiety. You know, I mean, so, you know, there's obviously, for every psychological or psychiatric diagnosis, there's kind of a biological and an environmental component, you know, to them, you know. But I would, you know, I would say the you know, conditions that maybe more you think of as more typically biologically driven, bipolar disorder, psychosis, you know, we've not seen the same uptick as the ones that certainly have a bit more of an environmental component. And then I want to go back, I forgot to respond. One of the thoughts also around, I think there's sort of two ways to think about the antidepressant, you know, question or the medication question. You know, one is, you know, one's more negative and one's more positive. One idea is, you know, obviously that, you know, people are getting treated earlier and that may, you know, set them up to kind of always be in treatment, you know. Another take on it is in some ways that we're treating major mental health issues earlier and allowing students who may not have been able to go to college or may not have been, you know, been able to function in a high stress environment to get the treatment that they need to be able to be academically functional, you know, at the same time as having your mental health issues. So I think there's two ways to kind of think about it, and there's probably a little bit of both, and you know, at the same time.
Does anyone have any other thoughts or anything else to add?
I want to just say one thing about because this is something I normally see students responding to, is when people talk about the increase in anxiety and depression in this generation. A lot of people do talk about, oh, it's because it's just destigmatized and people are now more willing to seek out services or seek out help. And I think it's really been destigmatized for quite a period of time. And so I really think this is a real uptick, and I think this is a real increase. And I guess what always worries me is if we just want to say, oh no, it's just due to destigmatization and the fact that people are now just more willing to seek out services that normally they wouldn't have before, that it really may blind us to what are some of the, you know, the contributing factors to this increase. And I think it's, you know, I don't think we ever want to be blind to things that are impacting our well-being, our functioning. I think we really want to take them seriously.
Izzy, would you like to add your response?
I just have a question for Dr. Lockhart. Do you think that the coincidence of seeing students spending, you know, less time at the dinner table, as you were saying, coincides with this uptick, or do you think that there are other factors about stress at school and, you know, the global situations like Dr. Hoffman was talking about? What would you say are more pressing or more relevant factors?
I mean, I think there's so many multiple factors. I think one of the things that's so interesting is if you actually look in societies such as Sweden, which is, you know, socialist democratic society, where I think they don't have a lot of anxiety about, are they going to be able to have their health care taken care of and their housing taken care of? You see the same kind of trends in adolescence there that you see in the United States. You see it in all these other countries, this sort of, you know, increase in anxiety, depression, and loneliness. You know, so you do wonder what, it's something that's impacting a lot of different people. You know, I think they're common trends here. And I think, again, that's sort of, you know, I don't think it's destigmatization can't explain those kinds of increases that you see in the other countries. And I, you know, I think a lot of times people say, well, Yale itself is so competitive, or people who go to Ivy League schools, that this is a special situation. But I think I'm right on this, Dr. Hoffman, I'm not sure. But I think you actually see these increases in state schools. You see it in any college you go to. I think you might even see it in community colleges. So it's not just this, you know, something special about being, you know, at the very top of the heap, in terms of the drive for perfectionism. It's something that really is impacting our whole country at all different levels in this particular age group.
That's right. I mean, it does seem to be it does seem to be a phenomenon across universities. It's not a Yale specific.
Juliet.
So I have another question, and this could go towards either Dr. Lockhart or Dr. Hoffman or anyone, truly. And it is, I know we typically tend to kind of point the finger, the blame goes to social media. But I know for certain people in certain sectors, they've tried to kind of revamp and revitalize social media to be a more conscious space and to be more realistic and to kind of share troubles and trauma. And so I'm curious to know, or to kind of get some feedback on, yes, social media can be to blame, but also where is the blame on the actual media as well? Because I think for a lot of young people, our experiences are really clouded by kind of growing up in this all or nothing society where everything is high stakes. There's always something bad happening, because in a way, the media can capitalize on bad things happening. And so it's much easier to draw it out or to kind of over dramatize a situation or appropriately dramatize a situation. And I think for most people who are my age or younger or older, we've kind of grown up in this very chaotic media-driven world where the world is always on fire. And I don't know that there's a way to kind of escape that kind of compounded trauma, especially in a time like COVID, a time where we've grown up with wars, even if they're not on American soil, but pretty high stakes situations. I don't know how anyone would be able to really cope with that in a good or a positive way. So.
I guess, yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really great point. Because I mean, it's easy to blame social media, and I'm sure I do it plenty. But social media is obviously just also a microcosm of society, right? I mean, it's just people reflecting what they think other people want to see, and media that we consume that's not just social media, but is from all different sources, right? There's kind of a profit motive, right? And so to be able to have people read something, it has to appeal in some ways emotionally, to you to be able to click it, and obviously the things that appeal most emotionally to people are often fear and anger, right? And so if we are constantly consuming media that in some ways we're kind of almost like compelled to click on because we're afraid and we're angry about something, then it's hard to escape that. You're just kind of marinating in that, all the time. So awesome.
I just wanted to sort of add to that, because I don't know that social media is itself the culprit. I think it sort of exacerbates maybe the seed of what's ever there. And it can do so in very, very negative ways, especially if somebody spends a huge amount of time with it. It's also just bad in other ways, just sort of physically, because people spend a lot of time on their screens at night and it disrupts their sleep and their circadian rhythms, which seems to be very important in depression and other mental disorders. So, but I do think that, people were afraid when couches were introduced because they thought that all sorts of terrible sexual activity would occur on couches, so there's all these things we've always been afraid of with every generation. And television was seen as this terrible thing, the third parent that was going to start socializing our children, as opposed to having parents socialize the children. And so I think every generation has had this thing that they can point to with fear. And so it's not just that, but I think it just adds to it. It just it sort of helps it grow, whatever it is that is there. And I think your point is really excellent about this generation growing up, just hearing this sort of so many negative things constantly. When one time when we were at Morris College, and my husband and I had a tea guest, and this was a woman who was from China. and she was the main broadcaster for Chinese news or something. Thousands of students from China came to see her. I guess she's very famous there, sort of the, I don't know, Lester Holt of whatever, Chinese news. And one thing she said is that in China, 70% of the news has to be positive news, happy news about China. And that's certainly not true of our news feed or our media feed. So much of what we see is negative and fearful and makes people afraid and feel, I think, makes them feel helpless. Like, what can they do about climate change? I mean, it's almost overwhelming. All the fires, all the, things that have been happening. What can you do about these wars? What can you do about the loss of homes and the refugee situation? How can we solve all those problems? That it can be overwhelming and make people feel very helpless. So I'm sure that the media does contribute just directly.
Thank you. I think does anyone have anything else to add, just to kind of stick to time? We can proceed to the next topic if anyone has nothing else to share. Are we okay to move on? Okay, perfect. So the next topic of discussion is the influence of the pandemic. So with the pandemic disrupting many aspects of our lives, we have witnessed an even further increase in the number of young people with worsening mental health. For example, in a study published by the National Alliance of Mental Illness, it was reported that 20% of college students saw their mental health worsen as a result of the pandemic. Moreover, the OECD found that the pandemic had the greatest negative impact on those aged 15 to 24, reporting that the number of young people dealing with any type of mental illness almost doubled in some countries throughout the lockdown and the pandemic. So considering that the pandemic has such a broad impact on our lives and the overall university experience, I've kind of broken this down into two parts, focusing on the mental health care and the student experience on and off campus. So the first part would be University Mental Health Care and Counseling. So Dr. Hoffman, being head of the Mental Health and Counseling here at Yale University, the first question I have for you is, what have been the biggest challenges that the pandemic has posed to the university mental health care system? And how have you responded to these challenges? And do you believe that these actions have been effective?
Yeah, I would say, the first, challenge is obviously we had to convert overnight from seeing everybody in person to seeing everybody virtually without having a platform or protocols or anything else like that. And with students suddenly flung, across 50 states with all different licensure regulations and things like that. And so, there was just so many logistical challenges early on to make sure we were able to continue care with people. And, and luckily we were, there were some changes, emergency orders that allowed us to, I think we were able to see people in 43 out of the 50 states, temporarily, which was which was good. So that allowed us to kind of continue seeing people remotely, over that summer, and so, but it was different, to do therapy with somebody who is living in their house, who may not have had a private space to do therapy, whose parents may not know that they're in therapy, who, and so, we did therapy with people when they were in their cars, when they were going for walks, and it was just a wildly different experience that I think most of us didn't have any experience with prior to that, and it was sort of an exercise in how to be, flexible. The other thing is, during a normal year, how to say this, people get better, and people get better and they leave treatment, when they get better. That's a very common, thing. Through the pandemic, what we saw is people were not getting much better. People were kind of staying where they were, and I think therapy helped a lot of people not get worse, and maybe not, go into as much of a depression or something like that as they would have. But we didn't really see people coming out and improving as much, as we would normally expect. And that was a real, challenge, as far as delivering mental health care, because, to be able to get people into treatment, you need to have some people leave treatment, you need to have some people get better. And so what we ended up with is a situation where we were taking on new people at the same time as we didn't have people, in some ways graduating from therapy. And that, again, kind of presented some challenges. And then the other challenge we had was, a lot of those emergency orders expired. So all of a sudden we were not able to do treatment with people in different states. And what we were able to do there, I was actually really happy with this, is we were able to extend coverage that we had. So people who were in states that we couldn't treat people in, if they had Yale hospitalization specialty care, so Yale was the only insurance they had, we were able to refer them to providers in their home states, and we covered the cost of that. And so, it meant that Yale students should not have been without the ability to access, treatment, where even if they were, in different states. So that was sort of one of the ways that we met the need. And I think, I'd say is I think everybody in the staff worked extremely hard to maintain seeing people over this course of the year under under difficult circumstances. And I think it was sort of it was a challenging year across the board, and I think it was a challenging year for everybody. But I do think given the resources we had and given the circumstances we had, we did see a lot of people last year.
Kind of touching back on the point that you made about people not really graduating from therapy and therapy not being as effective. I know that, or from like classes I've taken in psychology, that there's a large emphasis that the patient-therapist relationship is really important. Do you think that had anything to do with people not improving, or what other factors do you think that may have contributed to that?
Yeah, I think, that could be part of it. I think my sense, this is anecdotally, this is not necessarily statistically, backed up, but, I think people tended to do better when they had been meeting with their therapist in person, first, and then transitioned. There was in some ways a little bit more of a basis, and kind of connection there. I think it probably was harder for people who've never met their therapist in person at this point. And there's a lot of people, to that degree. So I do think, there is something, a lot of research indicates that, that telehealth is effective, so it's not as if it's not an effective medium for providing treatment, but I just feel like there's got to be something you lose, right? You can't look a person directly in the eye when it's Zoom. You can't get a sense of a person's mannerisms in the same way. You don't and so I do think that that probably did have an effect on people. But I also think the world was a very difficult place to live in, and so I think that's sort of one of the challenges for getting better is no matter how much internal work you did and how much psychological work you did, you still at the end of the day had to take all your classes in Zoom. You were in your room a lot. Everything was harder to do. It's like everything that you normally did without thinking required like 3 extra steps this past year, and I think that's just fatiguing. Even just going to the grocery store and having to walk down one direction aisles. It just adds a layer of intentionality to something that's often just automatic. And so I think there's something maybe to the fact that there does feel like a less personal connection maybe over Zoom, which may contribute to it. But I also think just the conditions in the world were not necessarily conducive to like thriving, for a lot of people.
Yeah. Does anyone have any thoughts or experiences, perhaps? Or?
Just related to that, I do think it is, if you look at sort of outcome therapy and outcome measures in psychotherapy, one of the things that does contribute is not just the relationship between the therapist and the client, but also what's happening to the client in the outside world. And I think because their outside world experiences were so limited, that a lot of their ability to sort of take maybe what they were getting from therapy, they couldn't experience that with others. They couldn't see changes. They couldn't get any of that, any of the positive things that might come from their experiences or interactions with other people, which normally happens when somebody's in therapy.
Thank you. So on to the more student experience. So as previously mentioned, 20% of students have seen their mental health worsen as a result of the pandemic. So to anyone who's willing to answer or share what their experiences have been, maybe with their mental health, or what have been their biggest battles, or what they thought had influenced their mental health the most, and kind of maybe how they overcome them, and what advice maybe you could give to people who are kind of still struggling with their mental health in the pandemic, because this is still very much ongoing. Anyone would like to add? Chelsea.
Yeah, I'd love to start. So personally, I think I maybe always struggled with mental health, but like having sport and having school and having everything in person and just being at college for my first year, there was just like a very limited time, I think, to really address like the issues that I had. I just don't think I had time to dwell on them. And I think, you know, going forward into the pandemic, all of a sudden you have all this time, you know, you're really no longer a student athlete, you're just kind of a student, but even more so you're a student online. So, you know, you don't have those 15-minute walks rushing to class. You have 15 minutes to go, for me, lay on the couch and, you know, surf through social media. And I think it was like during this time, I was like really like sitting with my thoughts, and I was sitting with just traumas that I had not really, I guess, faced. And it was just really detrimental to me personally. And it took a while, but I did start going to see a therapist. You know, I went through, there were like Yale Athletic specific mental health resources. And I think I used them maybe once or twice, but it just wasn't for me. So I went and found my own therapist. And, you know, I think I've gotten better. I certainly feel better. But it was really a first step, really just, you know, there is something wrong, and, you know, I don't have to feel like this. And it was really that validation kind of pushed me forward. And then now I think I'm on a better path. So, you know, taking that first step is so scary, but definitely worth it.
So great to hear that you're on a better path and that you're feeling better. Griffin, would you like to add anything?
Yeah. First of all, I'd like to apologize for being late. I'm just at work and there's dealing with a bit of a work emergency. Also, if I jump away all of a sudden, I work at a group home for at-risk youth. So if something happens, I gotta like leave right away. But I think in regards to the pandemic and student experience, I mean, I was only part of, like, I took the full year off because I knew that going to school online and trying to be successful in that and dealing with my mental health struggles would be pretty much impossible. And I think for like more broadly for like all students, I mean, humans are inherently social beings and need that social connection. And I think there is something beautiful in, and as a student, like we all kind of know this, you seem to like connect with people, especially when things get really hard in the class. And when you take that away, and students are forced to just do it online with, you know, minimal connection with other people, it's really hard to thrive and be successful in classes. And I think, I mean, this isn't my personal experience, it's my identical twin brother's personal experience, but he did go back to campus in the spring this year and had to do a 17-day quarantine. And he said that, you know, being somebody that, you know, struggles a little bit with mental health, like it was pretty dark for him. And things got really hard. And yeah, I think obviously a global pandemic is an emergency that requires immediate attention, but it's kind of like this impossible situation where, you know, you're dealing with the lives of other people with, you know, in regards to COVID, but you're also dealing with the lives of students and student athletes with mental health issues. Like you're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, but I definitely think that COVID has really negatively impacted the student experience at Yale and, anywhere.
Juliet, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, and it was after something specifically, Griffin, you said about how people really come together in a class when it gets hard. And I 100% agree with that. I think that's so critical to the experience of people. Just when it's really difficult, they make things happen. But that also goes, I think I saw that in the pandemic in a way that I'd never seen in my 4 years prior. The way students were able to kind of engage in this collective action to hold the university accountable, to advocate for students, for their peers who could not advocate for themselves. And I think one of the greatest examples, which I never could have ever anticipated or expected to come from Yale, was universal pass-fail. I did not see that coming at all. And I know there's very strong opinions on either side, but I became incredibly grateful for even just the discussion of it, that Yale students were able to recognize that the Yale experience was not equal and that the Yale experience is hard, and to be a college student anywhere is hard. And I think to kind of reach this conclusion that we need to be more gentle with ourselves, we need to be more gentle with our peers. I had professors who were probably the strictest, most rigid people I'd ever met in my life. It was my second semester senior year. It was tough. I'm writing a thesis. And they were willing to it wasn't so much me approaching them for extensions, it was them giving extensions. It was them saying, in the grand scheme of things, does this really matter? I don't know, but get it done when you can. And that was something that I'd never seen in my Yale career up until that point. And it took this very tragic and traumatic event to do it, and it shouldn't have taken that. But I don't know what Yale looks like now. I don't know in this return to campus world, like if that sympathy still exists. But I know that when I left Yale, I kind of left with this lens of, wow, this is a place full of good people who only want everyone else to succeed. And then in the same vein, for what Dr. Hoffman had just mentioned in terms of retaining access to mental health treatment, even once students are back at home and trying to battle these licensing issues because you're practicing across state lines, the level of effort and work that Yale did, especially as someone who works in higher education now, and has so many friends at big state schools. I came from an inner city public school in Virginia, and most of my friends ended up at big state schools. And it's like night and day. And in this weird way, I think I was very resentful of Yale in so many ways, especially in terms of mental health and counseling, but it really came full circle in that there is a difference here. And there are people who genuinely do care about your success. And in some weird way, my personal mental health improved because of that. I won't say overall it improved because the collective trauma is so great. But yeah, I left with this very optimistic lens of what Yale could be.
Olivia?
Yeah, I just wanted to go off the point about sort of like sympathy for yourself and kind of for students during this time. And I would just say that with my experience in high school, obviously, like I didn't have any sort of senior year, and it started during my junior year. So my junior year is probably when I started having like the most like problems with my mental health, specifically like anxiety, I think, just because of stressors like sports and academics and just kind of everything ramping up. At that point, I was going through, recruiting and, standardized testing, all that stuff. And it just kind of compiled. And then the pandemic happened. And obviously there are all of these really horrible things happening in the world. But at the same time, it sort of removed some of my stressors because everything kind of paused. So, school sort of paused. It was a much slower pace. I was working out at home. So my practice schedule was a lot less. And like extracurriculars were almost, canceled in most aspects. So I think very weirdly, like that was one of the areas where it sort of benefited me, which I feel horrible saying because I know that there were so many people who are struggling. And I think that I sort of built over the pandemic, being in like a supportive home environment, a little bit more sympathy for myself. And I adapted a little bit more to a pace that I could manage. And so by seeing a therapist and kind of, talking to somebody about how I was in a way, like allowing myself to become overwhelmed and putting too much on my plate, by kind of addressing that and having the time to address it during the pandemic, I think I sort of started to do a little bit better. And then I think when not that everything returned to normal, but in my like high school setting, I started going back to practice, and I had school more fully online, where I had like an entire day of schedule, and it was on Google Meets, and I was getting the same number of assignments as I had gotten in years prior. That was when it got a little bit harder again, because it was definitely not the same as the first spring when the pandemic happened and everybody was like just sort of trying to figure it out. And I think for me, that was probably the hardest point, because it was returning to bad old habits that I, kind of let myself fall into with studying and with schedules. And I think now, kind of going into a college setting, that's one of the positive things I've gained, is just sort of knowing my limits a little bit. But I think a lot of students are in the same situation as me, where they're kind of questioning if they can adapt again to something more competitive and do that in a way that's not going to damage their mental health.
That's actually, I'm glad you brought that up, because that was actually one of my next questions, on whether like people maybe thought that there were some positives that came out of the pandemic. I know that I'm a student athlete myself, and kind of going into the pandemic, I am losing like competition in a season that I kind of lost a sense of like identity and like who I was as a person, and kind of like who I am beyond my sport. But at the same time, I kind of was in a very similar position to you, Olivia, going into college, like going in like 1,000 miles an hour, not really having a time to stop and take a break. And it kind of carried into like my freshman year. And when the pandemic happened, I kind of thought, okay, the lifestyle I'm living isn't very healthy. I'm juggling too many things at once, and I really need to think about, okay, how can I improve myself as a student and as an athlete? And the pandemic kind of gave me that opportunity. And it was a really hard mental battle, but I think that mental battle really taught me like strategies that I can bring into my school and academic year. That I think can help me like improve my mental health in that sense. But Griffin, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, so the one thing for me about the pandemic that was interesting is that actually with school going past fail and things kind of stopping, I was actually able to finish my spring semester early, and I was able to go to a residential treatment center for 9 weeks, where I was able to kind of, at the time I was in a really, really, bad place. Bit of a warning, trigger warning here. Like I was, actively self-harming, failed at taking my own life twice. So the pandemic kind of coming in March in the United States when I was at school kind of saved my life, because it sent me home, to a more supportive environment where my parents could kind of keep an eye on me. And then it allowed me to finish my classes early and go to treatment center. And along the same lines as what you were saying, Sophia, is it canceled my sport. And I think my identity has been something that I've struggled with for a long time. It's part of the mental health issues that I deal with. And I think it taking away my sport gave me the opportunity to figure out some stuff, some other things that I liked, some other things that I wanted to do, and to develop a better understanding of who I was, not maintain the idea that I'm just an athlete and that's all I am. So there were a few benefits of the pandemic, I suppose.
Thank you. Izzy, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, sort of building off of that point, I think for me, the beginning of the pandemic sent me home to California trying to do school, with the time difference was not not the ideal situation, right? But it also like, I think my general understanding of the pandemic is that it really accelerated a lot of things that were already in motion, right? Talking about how it exacerbated concerns that were already, happening, that the factors didn't change, but they became more intense. And so, for me, I was struggling with my mental health already, through the last 2 years at Yale, and then everything, coming to a head and sending me, also into a very dark place. And it took a couple months, but I found myself in a very like powerful way, right? With my sport taken out of the picture, with, having to talk to my friends, via FaceTime, like I was able to spend a lot of hours in my own head in a very productive way. And that's definitely not like the universal experience, but I definitely know that my conversations with my friends about mental health like happened more and more through the pandemic. And I was able to, that came to the front, I think, for a lot of people, and those friendships got deeper because of those factors.
Christy, your hand was up first, and then we'll go on to Paul.
Yeah, I guess I actually have sort of two questions. I guess I was sad to hear sort of Juliet's comment about that at last these professors seem very human and to take into account students functioning, because I think professors always do care about how students are functioning, but oftentimes we're really helpless to do anything about it, that most extensions have to go through deans. We're not supposed to know or ask or even inquire, even if a student never shows up, kind of what's going on with them privately, that's something only the dean can know. And so it's the kind of system where you can't really respond to a student. When I first came to Yale from Cornell, I actually gave a student an incomplete in a class. I didn't know I wasn't able to do that, and I really got yelled at for doing so, because that was only allowed by the dean. And yet this was a student who clearly struggled, who needed more time, and was a great student. She could do it, and I had no doubts about that. So there's a lot of things that are not, a lot of professors don't have control over a lot of that. The other thing I wondered about was, what are the stressors that you find the most difficult at Yale? Is it balancing all the different pressures from being, for example, an athlete or extracurriculars and the academic and friends? Is it one thing? Are the classes particularly difficult? I mean, where does the most stress come from? And I guess I'm wondering, hearing you talk about kind of being torn between your athletic identity, your, the classes where everything becomes suddenly just, wow, this is a really hard class. What are we going to do about it? Or, spending time with friends. How does this all sort of accumulate into creating stresses or difficulties for you?
Juliet, would you like to answer?
Yeah, so one, I also wanted to kind of give a response. I think I found the most difficulty in communicating with professors in upper level STEM courses. I think a lot of, in smaller classes even, not even in the big lectures, I think I found a lot of difficulties just communicating generally or trying to get like my point across, or even asking for an extension. It was kind of this, you're low on the totem pole kind of deal, like, and no, get over it, kid, kind of deal. I noticed this less in more of the classes specifically for my major. I was in a very supportive major, environmental studies, just a really great group of people. And I actually was incredibly close with my dean. And my dean was probably my closest advocate at Yale, and almost served as a guidance counselor in a sense, and knew everything about me, everything about my family, what I was doing on any given day. And I think that was a wonderful experience, but I don't think that's the experience that all Yale students have. Even with my particular dean, I think it really depends on the student. And then again, in the residential college, what that relationship is like. And so I do think increasing transparency across the college, what deans are capable of and what they're not capable of, could really aid those relationships. But then another note on what you asked about what is the biggest stressor at Yale, I cannot speak for everyone, and I'm also not a student athlete, so I had a huge level of stress removed from me. But I had a very difficult high school experience. I went to a very low income inner city public school with Title I funding. Really had no expectation of ever going to a big, great school like Yale. But I found that my mental health, despite poverty and trauma at home when I was growing up, really became the worst it had ever been when I was at Yale. And it was simply due to the atmosphere, this kind of culture of everyone's amazing, everyone's going to do great, you're going to keep grinding, it's the norm, I'll see you at Bass at 2:30 in the morning, we can go to Mamoon's afterwards. And it's that culture, it's this idea that this is what's normal, this is what's expected, this is how I'm going to get that great analyst position and make big money outside of college, which is, you know, kind of a bizarre track to be on, period. It kind of limits your perspective. And when you're big, when everything you are, all of your identity is tied to this, and the stakes are so high for what is in reality a not that important problem, such as you're studying for an exam for a week straight, you get a C on it. You know, no one cares. No one cares that you got a C on the exam. But when you're in that moment, you can't see that. Yeah. And I think just the general perspective of Yale, of just being in this hyper competitive environment, but also in this hyper successful environment, because the students who go to Yale, they are successful. They've always been successful. I think to accept failure and to just close your laptop at 10:30 at night and just go to bed, I think that's easier said than done. And I think that that's a much broader cultural shift that's so far beyond Yale even. But I think that that was my biggest stressor for sure, was the expectation that that was what I should be doing. And if I wasn't doing that, I shouldn't be there.
Does anyone have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is, again, it's sort of like keeping in perspective what your goals are, what are your, you know, what you value in life. And I do think in Yale, there's this belief that everybody has been the top of their class. They've been the best. And maybe people haven't experienced a lot of failure. Maybe they really, you know, haven't realized that, yeah, you can fail at things and still be really successful in life, or you can not get all A's and still go on to have a great career. You know, and maybe that's something that needs to be addressed early on in people's college career. You know, just what are your priorities? What do you really want to get? What does it mean to be you know, what kind of job do you really want? Is it the money, or is it a job that's really going to be interesting and keep you kind of engaged for the rest of your life? Is it that important that you earn tons of money? I mean, we all have a lot in this country compared to other places, and yet we're unhappy people. So it can't just be the material goods.
No one else has their hand raised, but except for
I think Paul.
So we'll go to you.
Yeah, I'm actually just going to go back to a previous thing. So I'm glad you went ahead with other people's, because I it was going back to your question about kind of what were there any positive things, you know, and I'm, you know, kind of heartened to hear, you know, some of your, you know, Sophia and Izzy and Griffin sort of comments, you know, because yeah, I think you know, nationally, globally, and everything, we're probably too early to have any hindsight about what's going to kind of come out of this. But I think, you know, on a personal level, I think that ability to kind of like look at what's happened over the last year and a half, and be able to kind of like think about what are the positives, what are the things that have kind of come out of this, is like so important, you know. And so I'm glad to hear you all do that, and I'm sort of like, you know, I'm sort of thinking a little bit about, you know, sort of Juliet's comment earlier about the flexibility and things like that. And I guess I'm hoping like one of the things that we can kind of do through this is Yale and Yale students and Yale administrators and faculty and everything, you know, can kind of get very stuck with tradition and like, this is the way things operate and this is the way things have to operate and this is the right way to do things. And, and I think we've spent, last, 16 months or so realizing we can do things in all sorts of different ways, and, maybe it's not perfect, maybe it's not ideal, but it's okay, and so I'm kind of hoping as we think about, again, I mentioned earlier, this sort of rise in perfectionism, maybe there's a way in which collectively there's a way we can say, not everything has to operate the way it's always operated. Maybe not everything has to operate in this like one specific way, but there's many ways to kind of accomplish, the mission of the university. And maybe there's many ways of meeting academic goals, and there's many ways of meeting personal goals that are not about just setting a goal and like accomplishing it the exact way that you anticipated it. So that's what I'm kind of hoping, there's some aspect of flexibility we derive, from this.
Flexibility would be great. I mean, I do know, I just have to say as a professor, there were so many times when I had students who weren't turning work in or something, and I would think like, okay, I probably have to contact their dean. But then if I contact their dean, is that going to be a negative thing? Is the dean going to see them as a problem? Maybe they're just kind of working through something. And so I try to contact them first. If they didn't respond, ultimately I would have to contact the dean. I'd be worried about that. Am I, putting them in a bad position? But there has to be flexibility. I mean, I think that as a professor, I always felt like I wanted the student to feel free to come to me and say, I'm just having trouble and I can't get this assignment in, for a couple of weeks. Just give me a break or something. It's not the end of the world. That would be fine. But sometimes Yale is a bit bureaucratic, and it's good to hear that they can be more flexible at times. And maybe that the pandemic has shown this, and we can grow from that.
Yeah, I'm really thankful kind of to hear everyone's experiences and perspectives throughout the pandemic. And I think this conversation, like this part of the conversation in general, I think is really important, especially moving forward, because there are definitely a lot of lessons coming out of all of this. And I think the purpose of this conversation as well is to help educate school administrators, help educate the school community in driving these changes. So I thank you for everyone for sharing that perspective. And it's a lot of times it's hard to volunteer yourself and put yourself forward and share something so personal. And so I like to, just before we move on to the next topic, I'd just like to thank you for sharing that vulnerability and being so outwardly spoken about your mental health experiences, because that really is what is going to help drive this change forward. So if anyone has nothing else really to add, we're going to kind of move on to the mental health stigma on campus kind of in general, and just kind of maybe talk about the new mental health care system that's being introduced. Because so recently a number of the Yale mental health system has kind of come under criticisms, mostly referring to the time that it takes to see a therapist. And to my understanding, that the response to this is that Dr. Hoffman, you helped introduce the YC Cubed care program at school. So perhaps maybe you could summarize the changes that you hope to see through this program, and maybe perhaps the thoughts that went into planning it.
Sure, and I'll just say it's YC3, even though the So this is something that's sort of been in the works for a little while, maybe 2 years now, with the idea of kind of building a resource that's very connected to Yale College. One of the things we've heard from students over the years is the kind of desire for access and quick access to kind of mental health providers, and there's always a little bit of a balance between the amount of treatment that you can provide and the amount of access for new intakes that you provide, new patients kind of coming in. And there's it's always a little bit of a balance to those sort of how to kind of manage this. So we wanted to kind of create a kind of a more quickly accessible program that both combined wellness resources that were kind of more preventative in nature, or and mental health resources that or easily accessible. And so, we worked with Yale College and, deans of Yale College, residential college deans, and kind of hashed out a kind of a program that we thought was going to work. And, and really we're going to sort of kind of roll it out this fall semester. We kind of had a soft launch in the spring semester, but we have 4 people who are community wellness specialists who are kind of focused on the wellness side of things, kind of skills, mindfulness, psychoeducation, and more programming based, and we have 4 excellent people in those roles. And they're available to meet also individually with people less focused on significant mental health concerns and more focused on kind of skill building and wellness. And then we have community care clinicians. So we have 4 psychologists and LCSW, licensed psychologists and LCSWs, who would be also able to do psychoeducational work, but would also be able to run groups that would be open to Yale College students and would have drop-in availability that you could schedule online for kind of immediate, appointments. And the idea is that, this is not necessarily going to be where you go to get year-long treatment for major depression, but is sort of a resource that you can access quickly, see a clinician, maybe 1 to 4, times or something like that for issues that may not be long-term issues, and that would and they would also be very connected with both kind of residential colleges, like specific deans, as well as being a resource for the cultural centers, for athletics. And so they would be kind of have affiliations with different groups on campus. So if you go in to see, your dean and you're having a hard time and they sort of say, why don't you talk to somebody, they could tell you who you should contact and like to schedule, a time to meet with them kind of right away. And so that's sort of the idea, because if you remember, we talked about like the range of things that we're seeing has sort of increased. And so, because of that, we thought having one track where we're kind of sort of tracking everybody into formal, psychotherapy didn't really match kind of the demand, what the needs of students were. So, so we've kind of created this program, and again, we feel like it will be, kind of fully realized, in the fall semester. We had hired about half of the people by last spring, and we should have a full staff by the fall. So that's, and we're sort of seeing that as adjunctive to mental health and counseling. So it's not, so in addition to those positions that we've created, we also, have 6 new positions that were created for mental health and counseling to create access. So the idea is, in some ways we need to build both resources up, both the ability for students to get quick access to, ongoing mental health treatment, as well as being able to create a resource that is kind of meeting the more like counseling, kind of immediate access needs. And obviously you would be able to, if you see somebody for 4 times through the YC3 program, they could refer you directly into mental health and counseling if it made sense for you to continue, continue an ongoing treatment. And it's also, fine if you're in ongoing treatment in mental health and counseling, if you feel like there's like a thing that you need to discuss kind of right away, and you could sort of schedule in the next couple of days an appointment, with one of the YC3 clinicians as well. So we're sort of thinking it as an adjunctive resource, not an in lieu of resource to mental health and counseling. And so I'm really excited about the program. I think it has a lot of possibilities, both in the ability to create programming and outreach and education, and partner with student groups around mental health education, as well as being able to provide kind of, again, quick access to treatment, and also being able to kind of refer directly into longer, medium to longer term treatment at mental health and counseling. So, and you can always just schedule an appointment directly with mental health and counseling. You don't have to go through the YC3 program, but it's an additional resource.
Interesting. Does anyone have any thoughts from the student body, or Chrissy, would you like to add?
I just have a question, and again, this probably brings up this very difficult area, and I think this is something that's been raised in my classes in psychology by students, and it's a concern that they have, and I know it was a concern when we were heads of Morris College, that a lot of students may be feeling suicidal, or they may feel very, very depressed and may show signs of suicidality. They're oftentimes very, very reluctant. So sometimes students who need the help the most are actually less likely to actually seek out any help, because, and one of the reasons they are is because they're afraid that if they go in and start talking to somebody, they'll be assessed as being suicidal and they'll be sent home. And sometimes they'll be sent home to worse environments than their Yale environment. They'll be taken away from their friends at Yale, who they find to be very supportive, and they'll be sent back to maybe a family environment that isn't the best environment for them. And so again, I think this is something that Yale has struggled with for years, and maybe there's no solution to that problem. But do you see any possibility of how to deal with that to maybe reach those students without them feeling threatened, that they're going to lose? I mean, you don't want the responsibility to fall on their roommates, but on the other hand, they're students who feel like, yeah, I belong here at Yale. I feel really comfortable. I have this big support system here, but I'm so afraid to go in and seek services because I'm so afraid that they'll assess me a particular way and I'll get hospitalized or I'll get sent home. And then, I'll really be left with nothing.
It's such a difficult question. I mean, I'm curious to hear what students have kind of heard. I mean, one of the things that it's hard to kind of debunk the myth. The few people. It's very rare that a student is forced to go on a medical leave. As we know, nationally about. The statistics are between 14 to 20% of students are, experiencing suicidal ideation. And what it means is we see a lot of people who are struggling with suicidal ideation, who that's a part of what we talk about in treatment. And it's part of what, and not everybody who's having suicidal thoughts needs to go to the hospital, but occasionally they do, and that's an important, it's an important way of helping protect students so that they get to a place so that they can get to a place where they're doing better, but I mean, I think there is a lot of fear that somehow there's going to be a punitive response to having suicidal thoughts, and that's, it's hard to debunk that, but I mean, a lot of people come into us who struggle with suicidal thoughts, and they get treatment for the conditions that are kind of leading to those suicidal thoughts, and they get better without going to the hospital. They get better, without taking time off from Yale. But sometimes students need to be hospitalized, and sometimes students need to take time off from Yale. And for the most part, people do that voluntarily. When for the most part, they aren't. Again, it's very, very, very rare that a student is placed on a medical leave without them being the ones that make that decision. And what it usually means is they need to be in a level of treatment that's incompatible with them being a full-time student at Yale. So,
Izzy, would you like to pick up from there?
Sure, yeah, I feel like my knee-jerk reaction is, more transparency from mental health and counseling could help debunk that myth, right? Like, I also think that could go hand in hand with more real, upfront, honest conversations about mental health on campus. There's this really strong focus, I think in some ways a very good thing, on let's promote wellness, right? Let's talk about study breaks, let's talk about, all of the good things that we can do. And I think that should absolutely stay, right? We need to teach people how to cope well, but let's have real, honest conversations about the really, excuse my language, crappy parts of mental health, right? Let's talk about the fact that sometimes suicidal ideation is completely passive, right? Let's talk about the symptoms of PTSD and how those affect students, right, in that environment. Let's talk about the fact that when you're depressed, the little things are the hardest, right? You can't get up and brush your teeth in the morning. Let's have those conversations, right? Let's talk about those things so that people know that they're not alone, right? And Dr. Lockhart was saying, let's reach those people who maybe don't feel comfortable going in, but can say, yeah, there's people here who are feeling the same as me, and I have community in that way. And so maybe, you know, together we can create solutions. And I think that starts from very like open, upfront, honest conversation about like what, you know, doing good looks like and what doing poorly looks like, and all of the like range of experiences that people have.
Griffin?
Yeah, going off of Izzy's point, and I have something similar. Before I went home because of COVID, I was kind of going through the process of potentially taking a medical leave of absence. And when I was doing that and going through that process, the process was really confusing for me, and there wasn't a lot of clarity about what was going to happen, how I was going to be supported. And I didn't really understand the whole, like, I don't know what it's called, whether it's like a admissions process, or there was like some hoops that I was going to have to jump through to get to return to Yale that had to do with academics and not with how I was doing. And for me, that was fearful. I became quite fearful that, you know, I would be going home under a medical leave of absence, that I wouldn't, like, basically would be dropped from contact with Yale, and that I wouldn't be able to jump through those hoops, and that I would, you know, lose my spot at Yale or my ability to go to Yale because of my mental illness. And that was something that was really scary for me. So I decided instead to try and tough it out. And had COVID not sent me home, I don't know if I would have made it through that semester. And I think that clarifying that the way that process works is vital to, you know, changing the feelings of students around taking a leave of absence. It shouldn't be something where you feel a tremendous amount of fear and shame for prioritizing your mental health over school. And for me, I felt academic integrity over my well-being and my safety. And it wasn't like I was beating around the bush and, you know, not talking about what was going on. Like, they knew I was suicidal. They knew I had been to the psych ward, like all of those things. And still, it really didn't feel like a very supportive conversation. I didn't really feel like I was being supported in my decision. And I think that for me, like that really dissuaded me from prioritizing my mental health. So changing the rhetoric around the medical leave of absence withdrawal, and also changing the stigma going to seek help at mental health and counseling. Like Izzy said, is a lot about wellness and study breaks and, you know, mindfulness and promoting positive self-talk and stuff like that. But I think we're missing the part where we need to talk about, like, we need to get down into the muddy, dirty, terrible parts of mental illness, because those things are just as important as promoting wellness, because, you know, things can change for people really quickly. You can go from, you know, having, you know, minor symptoms of anxiety and depression to being like really in the thick of a deep depressive episode. And if you have no idea how to reach out for help or how to talk about what's going on, then, you know, you're not really going to be feeling supported in going and seeking help. So those two things would be definitely helpful, I think, for me and for other students. You know, thinking about maybe taking a medical leave of absence, or just feeling supported in their mental health journey at Yale.
I just Sophia, I have to leave, but I just wanted to say, Griffin, I just really appreciate what you said, and I do think this is a real issue for Yale students. And I think one of the things I know that they oftentimes struggle with is even if they take a medical leave of absence, I think there's courses you have to take, and oftentimes you have to pay for them yourself, and you might be somebody who's on financial aid or something, and it's, you have to find that course, and it's a very difficult process. And I think the transparency is a huge issue, and I just appreciate everybody sharing all their thoughts, because I think this is all these are very, very important issues, and I hope I've been able to contribute something. I'm sorry that I have to leave at this point, but thank you for including me.
Well, thank you so much for coming. Your insights have been incredibly useful and eye-opening, and thank you for your participation, and have a good rest of your day.
My pleasure. Bye-bye.
Olivia, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I just actually had a question because so from the high school that I went to, there were actually a lot of resources, but they weren't really accessible. Like, it was very hard to tell what was available unless you really looked into it. And generally, like, you were not reached out to by the school unless you sort of went to somebody, or somebody like reported you to a guidance counselor or something. And I was just wondering, kind of as an incoming freshman, like, if you guys felt welcomed by Yale in terms of mental health resources, and if those were made available to you, and if they are accessible, or if you sort of have to go searching for them as a student.
Does anyone with that experience like to share? Or
I think I can share from the perspective of like what is available to first years, but I cannot speak on what like the lived experience actually is, because I think that varies so drastically. Mm-hmm. And I can say that the dialogue that we receive as first year counselors is very much so to kind of emphasize the access to mental health and counseling, and to really actively encourage it as much as possible. And so when you come to Yale, you will have a first year counselor, you'll have a team more than likely of first year counselors who are all available to speak with you and can kind of give you more information and kind of act as this almost like consultant to what is available at Yale and what you can utilize. I do think that one of the greatest problems though with that is that typically first years, you're going into a new, very foreign environment, and you're going to want to kind of protect the information that you have about yourself and protect your emotions. And I think first years are very hesitant to kind of reach out to another person when they've already told their first year counselor or already told their dean. It's kind of exhausting to be constantly re-explaining yourself. And then there's this kind of looming cloud over that, and that in the reality of being seniors who are first year counselors, we know the experiences of our friends and our peers and ourselves at mental health and counseling. And in the past, historically, there's been a significant amount of time you spend waiting to be seen. And so a lot of students will come to Yale with critical need for mental health resources, and they need them sooner rather than later. But when you're a first year, you're waiting for your intake appointment. And I know in some years, even as a returning student, I was waiting for months. And first years can be waiting for months. And in that critical time when you're adjusting to Yale, and it's such a huge adjustment for so many, and I would say the majority of students, that waiting period is critical. And I know there's been efforts to reduce it. I know we talk about this on a regular basis, and I'm not sure really what can be done about it, because I think it's almost this kind of conundrum where you add more counselors, but then there's more students, and you add more counselors, but then there's more students. And Dr. Hoffman can probably speak to this. But in my experiences, we really try to emphasize what is available, but it all comes down to the transparency and the reality that it takes time, and it's not instant, and it's not equal. I have peers who have had therapists who they did not like, they didn't connect with. I've had peers who've been misdiagnosed, and then after college realized, oh, I actually didn't have depression, I had untreated ADHD, and things like that. And it's just not an easy fix. And these resources are very well publicized. In theory, they are there, but in practice, there are a lot of barriers. worse, and you can't deny that, even under the best effort to fix it. And I do think, Griffin, I think your experience is really critical here and kind of showing like what you've been through.
Griffin, you can take up the point now.
Yeah, so I mean, I have a little bit more kind of lived experience around being an incoming first year with, well, I'm a sophomore, but when I came into my first year, I'd been struggling with mental health issues since I was 15 years old. And when I got to Yale, it was like somebody just turned up the volume on that to like full blast. And, I had the benefit of having a first year counselor who was amazing, who had experience with her own mental health struggles. And I was able to talk to her a lot about mental health and counseling and going to seek help. But I think that as far as for a first year that's coming on campus that's potentially worried or wants to go seek mental health and counseling, unfortunately the wait times are long, and that's just due to an overwhelming amount of students that need mental health and counseling. So I would first of all suggest going on the first day you get there. But I think that one thing that can be done better is just, I know that the first year counselors and a lot of the stuff that you do in your first week is it's a whole lot of information just being thrown at you all the time. And I think constantly reiterating to first years that there are these supports out there is really important. And, maybe having conversation with your first year, your FROCO group that, you talk about the importance of reaching out for help would be important. And one thing that I'm not sure about this, whether this happens or not, but I think what could be helpful is having first year counselors or your FROCO, be able to explicitly guide students towards mental health and counseling, instead of just being that person that's that's just there for them, being able to help them, go through the process of seeking help. And I think just that decrease so if we can have more transparency and less, and less stigma, I think that would be really important for specifically first years coming into campus and making sure that they're getting the care that they need.
There's also, sorry, don't mean to cut you off, Sophia.
Oh no, I apologize.
There's also
you can go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, sounds good. There's also several groups on campus that do different areas of work. So for example, ties into mental health, not necessarily addressing it directly, but there's the CCEs who work on sexual misconduct and all of the effects it does have. And there's the Share Center, which focuses on sexual misconduct, but is also a place to go talk to people. And so I think the more that, like Griffin was saying, FROCOs can connect their first years to those resources that exist, I think is, the best outcome possible. I think what I've heard is that all of the worries that people have about mental health and counseling and access to resources are compounded for people with marginalized identities as well. And so working to accommodate people, meet them where they're at, and also, recognizing that a therapist who's good for one person isn't going to be great for another.
I'll go to Josh first and then Dr. Hoffman.
Yeah, Izzy, just working off what Izzy had said there with encouraging people to reach out to different resources, not necessarily just Yale Mental Health, but other areas to receive counseling. And if I could add one thing, this entire conversation, my big point and my more lived experience has been being vulnerable with friends and support groups and internal support groups. And I think this conversation is a group of people that are very mental health conscious. And I think it's important that we as people that are conscious of mental health and mental health issues are someone we set an example by reaching out to friends and letting them know that we're there for them, because it can be difficult to go get professional help or find the proper resource for yourself. But having those built-in support groups are something that are always there as a kind of first level of defense, so to speak, is incredibly important. And I don't think everyone's conscious of those types of things. I don't think everyone is ready to be that for their friends, but I think making your friends and the people around you aware that you can be that resource and be a support system and someone to be leaned on is incredibly important as a way to set an example by people that are conscious of mental health and mental health issues. It's something that I leaned on my friends a lot. It's kind of my more lived experience than in the professional setting, is more just leaning on my support system. And as a result, I've much more tried to make myself available in that sense to the people around me. And I think it's important as people that value and believe in the importance of focusing on mental health, that we form that same kind of support system. And it's really important that Yale community becomes that for people. So.
Dr. Paul Hoffman, if you would like to share your thoughts.
Sure. Yeah, I just wanted to kind of get back to the wait time, issue, because I think it's one of the big conundrums, I think, in college mental health, is how to get people through the door, in an appropriate amount of time. Because I think, even thinking kind of what Griffin said, one of the things that happens is the trend has been not only to see more people, but to see more people coming in earlier and earlier in the school year. And I think that, that part of that is the anxiety about getting in, right? If you're worried that it's going to take a long time, then people try to come earlier because they kind of assume a wait. And so you end up, by October last year, we had already seen 3,000 new individual students coming in for treatment, and so, the answer, I think, is in some ways creating some like variation in options, so one of the things that I did, because it's predictable, that August, September, October, it's going to be hard. It's going to take a while to get in for an intake. This year it actually was a little bit less than previous years. It hit a max of about 2 weeks for that initial evaluation, but is to create same day intake appointments as an alternative. And so we've done that for 2 years. So if a person calls up, is given an appointment in 2 weeks and says like that's too long, then they're given the option of coming in the same day, for an evaluation. And so that's been, because we can't just automatically see more people, creating sort of variations and options has been one of the ways that we've been working on that. And I'm hopeful also that, again, the YC3 program, if a person feels like they've got something that they need to talk about kind of more urgently, but is not necessarily a long-term issue, that there's an option for students, to go in, through that avenue as well. And I mean, I think also, so hiring more counselors does make a difference. Ultimately it can't be the only solution, you go with, but ultimately, you have to make sure that your department is right-sized for the number of people seeking treatment, and one of the things that, one of the things I can say is, Yale is one of, I think to the point about people like in maybe FROCOs and administrators and deans being very like, positive about seeking mental health treatment, is that we have one of the highest utilization rates from counseling center of any school in the country, and one of the highest for any school our size. And so the average college counseling center would see maybe 12 to 13% of its students in a single year, total students. Yale sees about 34% of its students in a single year, and so. So I do think that a lot of the efforts, that students make and CCEs and FROCOs and residential college deans make to kind of encourage seeking mental health treatment does work. I mean, it does lead people to coming into mental health treatment. I think though that, part of what we need to think about as a campus is not just a singular resource, right? I mean, there are other resources. There's peer support resources through Walden. There are wellness resources which are not the same as mental health resources. I think that's one thing to make clear is wellness and mental health are two different kind of areas, even though they both address mental health. But there are resources on campus that are not only mental health and counseling because it is a thing that there can be a wait for. Now, I should also mention though that wait is variable. So not everybody waits the same amount of time, and that's because at that first appointment, there is a kind of determination of whether somebody needs to get in right away, and there can't be a wait because that person needs immediate treatment. So there are some people whose wait time is 0, and there are some people whose wait time is several weeks, So anyway, that's a long thing about that, but I do think it is a real challenge, a real challenge as a clinic to kind of work with. But I think we've got several ways in which we're working on it, and I'm kind of hopeful. The only thing is obviously enrollment is going to be way up this year. So that's even with additional clinicians. There is going to be a bigger enrollment for Yale this year.
Thank you, and it's good that we had this conversation because it is important that students on campus do know what other resources are available to them, because mental health is a broad spectrum and in terms of what people need in order to address their problems. So it's good to highlight all those resources available that may be more beneficial to maybe perhaps more people specific issues. I am a little conscious on the time because we are coming up to an hour and a half. I do have a couple of closing questions, but if anyone else has anything to share on this point now, we do have, I can add another 5 more minutes. I don't know if anyone here has places to be or if we can move on to just the last section of the conversation. Is everyone okay? Okay, perfect. So kind of just to close out the conversation that we had today, and kind of just focusing on the timeline of this whole trend of where young people are having worsening mental health. It's kind of looking forward into the future. So as we discussed, over the past 10 years and even over the past 5 years, mental health amongst young people has gotten significantly worse. So I don't know if, Paula, you're able to offer some insight on this and where you think that this trend will be going perhaps in the next 10 or 15 years, and whether it's just going to get worse or if perhaps we could see some improvement in people's mental health.
I tend to be an optimist and kind of hope that we sort of see the trend sort of level off at some point. I don't know what the time frame for that is, but I think one of the things that's interesting is I'm thinking back to the conversation we had about media and technology and things like that is the reality is you kind of can't turn back the clock to a time when social media didn't exist. You can't turn it back to, so in some ways the solution can't be to do the things we did 15 years ago, right? 20 years ago. So I think, the real answer here, I think is kind of, I want to say that it's with you all a little bit, right? I mean, you all are the ones who are kind of living through this experience, and in some ways, there needs to be an adaptation to the way that we, sort of function that allows people to thrive a bit more. And again, the answer can't be in the past, but I think it was Juliet who mentioned the idea of intentional communities and places where people are able to even through social media form authentic connections where they're talking about real issues. I mean, there's a real positive in that, right? I mean, so I think the question is sort of how how do we identify the problem, one, and how do we find solutions that are kind of rooted in what actually is happening and what we have going forward. And I don't think the solution is all about everybody has a mental health provider all the time. I don't think that can, I think that's in some ways kind of down, that's downstream, so to speak. It sounds like, there's a lot of like cultural, societal, technological features that need to be kind of addressed and thought about. And I think probably the best solution comes from the people who are, in it a little bit. And so I'm hopeful, because I do think, I do think people adapt and societies adapt, when they identify a problem. And so, but I don't know what the time frame is, to be honest.
Thank you. Does anyone have any other thoughts, or where they think perhaps this trend will go, or perhaps any societal changes that they would like to see coming out of this? Or Izzy?
I think, speaking sort of looking at the next year, I have 2 years left at Yale. I think that something really cool that I've seen happening and starting to happen and building is like the entrance of like mental health discussions, like specifically in athletics as well. Speaking in like my capacity as a student athlete on campus, like I think that as coaches become more aware, as the university rolls out programs like Why You Matter, which is focused on providing education and advocating for mental health resources for athletes, and just, starting those conversations. Like I think that, Dr. Lockhart mentioned, that she thought that mental health had been destigmatized. I like respectfully have to disagree. I think that there's a lot of spaces where that conversation isn't being had. And so hopefully, over the next decade, as those conversations happen, as people become more aware, connect with more people, we're able to eliminate some of that loneliness, right? One of the causes, and then we're also able to address the end solutions.
Josh, would you like to add to that point?
Yeah, just working off that, and then actually something Olivia said earlier. Moving forward, I really just hope, especially as I think increasingly people are moving into a remote work environment or school-at-home environment, et cetera, and spending more time alone. I think I hope people are more and more able to recognize and have sympathy for themselves. Just plain and simple. I think recognize that. I think it's a phrase thrown on a lot. I don't know if it is as much anymore, but it's okay not to be okay, and that's just how things are. And develop that conversations internally with your friends, family, and your own support networks, and have sympathy for yourself, and recognize that you're human, and that's important, because other people are going through the same exact struggles you are in your community and around the world. And I think it's incredibly important that we continue to develop that mentality that it's okay, and you're not going to be perfect, and have sympathy for yourself based on what you're going through, and understand that things aren't always going to be perfect. You're not always going to be, a academic, professional, machine. Like, you're a human being, and that's important. So that goes along with ending the stigma and changing the stigma and changing the idea around mental health issues. So I think that was really important, Olivia, when you shared that earlier, and just sympathy for ourselves is important. So.
Dr. Hoffman?
Yeah, I think getting to this sort of stigma issue, which I think is kind of important. There's sort of a, they sort of sometimes divide like stigma into like basically personal stigma versus perceived stigma. So how much would I judge somebody who goes to mental health treatment versus how much would I perceive somebody else to judge? People, and perceive and personal stigma has gone way down. But perceived stigma has still stayed much higher. Like I expect other people to judge, me for seeking mental health treatment. So I think that's kind of important to mention. I think it's also important to mention that stigma is different for many different groups, and many different identities and many different sort of subgroups, and so, it's hard to sort of measure like one measure of stigma, because it might be stigma might be different in for student athletes than it might be for non-student athletes. It might be different from from international students than it might be from people who grew up in the US. It might be different based on background, racial background, economic background. So there's there's sort of general stigma, but that's a kind of amalgamation of all different types of stigma. And so I think sometimes, what we have to sort of do a little bit is is not think about it as like one large group, but think about, you know, where are the groups that are important to kind of reach out to, you know, where stigma may be higher, you know, and so so that's, I think that's, I just wanted to add that in there.
Thank you. I think that would conclude our conversation for today. If anyone has any other points they would like to add, or maybe the questions, or maybe just general thoughts on today's roundtable that they'd like to share, you can do so now. But otherwise, I would just like to thank you all again for coming to such an important conversation, and again, being so vulnerable. And I think it's students like you who are, like we spoke about, like, who are kind of leading the way and showing that it is okay to talk about your mental health, and kind of and showing that you're there for other people, and kind of, yeah, just being excellent role models. So I'd like to thank you again for being a part of this conversation, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. I think I'm going to stop the recording now.